Would you please stand as we read John 1:43 through 51 this morning? The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." When Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, he said of him, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael asked him, "Where did you get to know me?" Jesus answered, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
For the rest of Advent, we're going back into Bible study mode, and in these remaining 3 weeks, we're going to focus on Jesus. This week, we're going to look at Jesus as a human being, and the title often given to him as was just read, Son of Man. Next week, we're going to look at Jesus specifically as a Jewish teacher, whom many call the Son of David, and what was going on in Judaism in that day. Who were those scribes and Pharisees and Levites and Sadducees, and what did they all do, and what's that about? And then on December 18th, we'll look at how all of that eventually morphed into the Christian belief in Jesus as the Son of God. So first, Son of Man and that title. Jesus is called Son of Man 88 times in the New Testament. The phrase appears 107 times in the Hebrew Bible, with 93 of those appearing in the book of Ezekiel. It's not particularly difficult to parse, and Son of Man doesn't represent some deep mystery. Son of Man simply refers to being human. Like you might say, I'm a mere mortal, or, we as humans do this. Son of Man is just about being a human being. Christian doctrine teaches that Jesus was fully human and fully divine, both at once. Don't ask me how that's possible, I just work here. But that's the doctrine passed down from the early church councils. While churches today often focus on the divine part, Jesus as Son of God, it's plain from the Gospels that Jesus wants his followers focused on the human part, because Son of Man is the primary title Jesus uses for himself, as you just heard in that passage. So let's begin there, with Jesus the man, Jesus the human being. What do we know about him? First, Jesus is a historical figure. The assertion that there once lived a Jewish man known as Jesus of Nazareth is a historical fact accepted by the vast majority of scholars. You can find naysayers, of course, just as you can find flat earthers, but they are in the same category. The evidence is overwhelmingly weighted towards the actual physical existence of Jesus. Scholars of all faith and of no faith agree that you can take the following points to the bank. Jesus was born a Jew somewhere between 7 and 2 BCE and was raised in the insignificant Galilean village of Nazareth. 2, he surely spoke Aramaic and perhaps also Hebrew and Greek. 3, he was baptized by John the Baptist, which is interesting because that puts all the weight of scholarship also on the actual historical existence of John the Baptist. Jesus' ministry was limited to the regions of Galilee and Judea. And the last thing is he was crucified at the order of Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect, somewhere between 30 and 36 CE. It's not a long list of facts, but it's a significant one. To talk about Jesus is not to talk about a fictional character. But fact-checking the life of Jesus is hard. When I applied to join the Mayflower Society and had to submit my family genealogical records, I had the most trouble proving the existence of my own grandfather, who I knew in the flesh. Verifying historical information for somebody who lived over 2,000 years ago is a tricky business. And it's in those details of what exactly Jesus said and did that scholarly kumbaya breaks up. After all, even the four Gospels differ on those details. But even if we can't get at every fact about Jesus' life, it's really helpful for Bible study to understand the cultural, political, and religious context of what you're reading. The Bible wasn't written in a vacuum, and Jesus wasn't born onto a piece of parchment. Just as Jesus was a real person, Nazareth was and is a real place. And the first century in the Roman colony of Palestine had very specific issues and challenges for the people who lived within its borders. Understanding those things helps us make sense of the stories and situations we read about in the Gospels. We'll deal with that specifically Jewish context next week and what was going on in the religious world. But for this week, as we look at Jesus the human, I want to look at Nazareth, the town where he was raised, and the general contours of Jesus' family and friends. The gospel accounts agree that Jesus was the son of Mary and Joseph, who made their home in Nazareth. Matthew has them settle in Nazareth after Jesus' birth, and Luke has them living in Nazareth before the birth of Jesus. But everybody puts the family there from when Jesus was very young. The family never moves, and all indications are that Jesus also remained in Nazareth until the start of his ministry around age 30. Nazareth as a town was East Podunk. It was a small, poor, nowhere town in the broader region known as the Galilee. Nazareth's reputation is evident from the Bible passage I chose for this morning about Jesus recruiting Philip and Nathanael as disciples. Philip is excited to join the group, and he runs to find his friend Nathanael to bring him along. Philip's recruitment line is, "We have found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth." Instead of jumping up in amazement, Nathanael sneers, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" That was, in a nutshell, the town's reputation. At the time of Jesus, Nazareth had no paved roads, no public buildings or inscriptions, and fewer than 400 residents. Some of the land was terraced for farming, and there was a stone quarry. Archaeologists have found no imported wares, no fancy mosaics, not even any plain mosaics. There was no glass. But wait, you say, Matthew and Mark both tell us that Jesus went home and preached in the synagogue in Nazareth. So surely there must have been at least one public building, right? Not necessarily. In the first century, the word synagogue referred to the gathering of the people, whether they gathered in a specially dedicated space or in someone's home. That might sound like a familiar concept. Just like we sing today that the church is not a building, that we, the people, are the church. Just like the earliest Christians had their first services in homes. It was the same for the synagogue in Jesus' day. The temple in Jerusalem was a building. The synagogue was a people, and they met in homes. as well as in buildings devoted to that purpose, if there happened to be one. Jesus likely read from a scroll at a synagogue service that met in a larger home in Nazareth. And there probably weren't too many of those. Homes in first century Nazareth were stone and mud with thatched roofs. Interior walls might have been rubbed with plaster and perhaps decorated with paint. Most homes were just a single room, often divided into public and private areas. Some areas of the home were on a raised platform. Those who did have more than one room would have had a central courtyard for cooking. Outside stairs sometimes led to a rooftop living area, partly shaded by matting or a partial tent. A home in Nazareth might have had a small window or two way up towards the roof, but mostly indoor rooms were dark and lit by oil lamps. Work was done either in the courtyard or on the roof. There would not have been furniture as we know it, no tables, beds, and so on, although there might have been a stool or two, or perhaps a chest. Nooks and shelves provided a place to put lamps, utensils, bedrolls, and clothes. There were separate storage areas, some underground, for water cistern and larger jars. Cushions, pillows, and mats provided comfort for seating and sleeping on the floor. Of course, much fancier homes existed at the time, but not in the rural backwater that was Nazareth. The Bible tells us that Jesus' father, Joseph, was a carpenter by trade. In a town like Nazareth, that would have meant basic, rough work, but it didn't mean only working with wood. The Greek term used for carpenter is broader and can refer to anything in the building trade, including thatching the roofs, and if it was required to build something, whatever the material was you're actually working with, a carpenter in Greek sort of covered all of that. Any given carpenter might have been either in the skilled or unskilled labor pool, but both of them required physical strength. Since Nazareth was so small, it's likely that a first century carpenter living there traveled to other towns in the region to find work. When Jesus was growing up, the nearby city of Sepphoris was being rebuilt by Herod Antipas, who was the son of Herod, the Herod at Jesus' birth. There are several Herods throughout the Bible. Herod Antipas ruled the Galilee and Perea regions during most of Jesus' lifetime. A good carpenter could probably have found plenty of work in the rebuilding of Sepphoris. Tradition in late antiquity claims Sepphoris as the birthplace of Jesus' mother, Mary. Probably Joseph's work also included crafting agricultural stuff, yokes for donkeys and oxen and plows. Since there's no indication that Nazareth imported anything, all the citizens of Nazareth were likely farmers in addition to their primary trades, so that there was a way to feed their families. But that particular aspect of life was in flux as Jesus grew. Once the rebuilding of Sepphoris was completed, Herod Antipas set about making it a center of wealth. And he did that by buying up lands in the neighboring towns. Nazareth was like 3.7 miles from Sepphoris. And then leasing that land back to the one-time owners to produce crops of his choosing and for his purpose. Local economies were devastated, and families lost any way of providing for themselves, even while doing the same work on the same land that they always had been, because the land was no longer theirs and the crops that they produced were no longer theirs. The abuse of the poor has not changed, even in their methods, in 2,000 years. Mary and Joseph were poor when Jesus was born. How do we know? Well, apart from settling in Nazareth, the Gospel of Luke tells us that when Joseph and Mary brought Jesus to the temple to satisfy the law of Moses, they brought the offering that was specified for poor people. Leviticus 12 specified that after bearing a male child, the mother had to wait 40 days before she could go to the temple to be ritually purified, and an offering for that was required. The preferred offering was a lamb, but Leviticus 12 verse 8 gives an option of 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons for those who couldn't afford a lamb. Luke 2:24 tells us that it was this poorer offering that Mary brought. The average life expectancy for a first century man anywhere in the colony of Palestine was a whopping 29 years. One might expect that in those poorer areas like Nazareth, they were lucky to make even that. We don't hear about Joseph after Jesus turns 12. Many think that's because Joseph died prior to the start of Jesus' ministry. If you were part of Colin and Ben's adult study on James, you know that Jesus had siblings. Matthew names 4 of them: James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. Matthew also indicates that he had sisters, but the sisters, surprise, surprise, don't get names. There's some evidence that the 2 sons of Zebedee who became Jesus' disciples, James and John, were also Jesus' cousins. And some believe the other James, remember there are 2 James who were disciples of Jesus, some believe that the other James among the 12 was actually the James who was Jesus' brother. They're all very common names. But to me, it seems likely that Jesus was biologically related to at least a couple of his 12 disciples, just as many of those 12 were related biologically in some way to each other. Further evidence of at least John being related to Jesus is that at his crucifixion, Jesus charges John with his mother's care. Tradition is almost unanimous that Mary went to live with John in Ephesus after Jesus' death and resurrection. And some traditions have Mary Magdalene joining them. In addition to family, Jesus also had friends. While some of those friends were likely part of the group of disciples who learned from Jesus in various times and places, there appear to be 3 very close friends of Jesus who didn't follow him from place to place, but who Jesus sought out and stayed with whenever he had the chance. They were the 3 siblings who lived together in Bethany, a small town just outside Jerusalem and 62 miles south of Nazareth: Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. The Gospels give us lots of Marys. It was also a very common name, so they're typically distinguished by where they made their home. Mary Magdalene is properly Mary of Magdala, a small town on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. This Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, is Mary of Bethany, because that's where they lived. The Bible stories we get about Jesus with these 3 siblings show a very close and loving relationship. They even feel comfortable enough yelling at Jesus about stuff and complaining, so it's a close relationship. And all the stories preserved about their relationship are significant ones. Mary and Martha famously clash when Jesus comes to visit, and Martha wants her sister's help in the kitchen. But Mary sits listening to Jesus instead. Martha asks Jesus to send Mary to help her in the kitchen, and Jesus refuses, saying Mary picked the better activity. I love that story. It's the one story in the Bible where I'm on the right side of things. You never find me in the kitchen. John's gospel tells us that Mary of Bethany was the woman who poured an expensive perfume on Jesus' feet and wiped them with her hair. Judas Iscariot, who was the treasurer for the 12 disciples, gets mad because the perfume was expensive and he thinks that was a waste. And of course, when Lazarus falls ill and dies, Jesus weeps at his tomb and then raises him from the dead. Jesus has lots of significant experiences with people who followed him around from place to place. Mary Magdalene was in that group, as well as Jesus' 12 main disciples. He also had notable one-off moments with people he encountered in his travels, like the Samaritan woman at the well, or people that he healed. But the family of siblings in Bethany, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, seem to have served as an anchor of friendship, as well as a home away from home when Jesus traveled from Nazareth in the north to Jerusalem in the south. Although our focus naturally shifts to the stories about the miracles and the power and the wisdom of Jesus' teaching, many places in the Bible show us a Jesus who simply knew what it was like to be human. He grew up in a family in a small town with not much going for it. He went hungry at times. He got tired enough to fall asleep in the bottom of a boat in a storm. Jesus got frustrated with his disciples and called them dense. He got angry and cursed a fig tree for not having figs, even though it wasn't even the season for figs. He felt compassion. He grieved the loss of his friend Lazarus with real tears. He went to weddings with his mother. He was homeless. He depended on others for support. Jesus felt righteous indignation at the temple economic system, made a whip and drove the merchants and money changers out. He called religious leaders nasty names and used a slur for a Canaanite woman asking for help. He worked from dawn until dark. He was anxious enough to sweat drops of blood. He prayed for important things he didn't get. He was strong enough to carry his own cross for a time, even after a severe beating. He knew what it was like both to be revered and to be mocked. He knew torture and death. While the Jesus of the Bible does amazing things that we can hardly imagine happening, I think his mass appeal comes from the fact that he is a teacher who is fully accessible to his students as a fully human being. We don't just see a triumphant resurrection. In fact, we don't see the resurrection at all. It's not described. When the women get there, he's already up and gone. But we do see, in intimate detail, a man pleading with God for a less painful road, and a brave man bearing up under brutal injustice. We don't just see a superhero casting out demons. We see a man wrestling down his own demonic temptations to fame, to power, and to glory. It's faith in the signs of Jesus' authority and divinity that leads people to worship Jesus. It's the wisdom of Jesus' teaching and example that leads people to respect Jesus. But I think it's the humanity of Jesus that allows us to remain hopeful for our own humanity. It's the Jesus who lived and laughed, suffered and died, as we all do. The fully human Jesus who leads people to love Jesus. Amen.